Well, for many millions of Africans across the continent, liberation from colonialism has meant very little without economic transformation, slow and stagnated. The promise of a new dawn in which everyone would be equal before the law and to pursue a life of happiness and fulfillment has remained just that, a promise that has never been fulfilled. Well, joining us to talk about the achievements and challenges of liberation movements in Africa is Professor Drik Kotze. Good afternoon, Prof. Always a pleasure having you on the SABC News Desk.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Well, across the continent, there are many inspiring examples of liberation movements who won against unjust regimes. But this change to political life or political party is not always an easy one, is it? How best can it be managed, and what are the challenges around a transition like this? We sometimes see an inability of some movements to adapt to politics beyond the struggle years.
Yes, that is indeed one of their main challenges, is because they are movements that are supposed to serve specific interest as movements, and once they have been elected as a government, then they must serve all the interests, the national interest in general, the interest of all the different segments of a society, and not only those of their own supporters. And that is one of the key challenges for many political parties. For example, in South Africa, when COPE was formed, that was one of the main arguments that was used by Monsieur Drik Kotze as the leader of COPE, to say that, according to him, that was one of the failures of the ANC, that the ANC became so much absorbed in their own interest, the interest of their movement, that they couldn't make the transformation towards that of a government that's supposed to serve the interest of all South Africans.
All right, Prof, let's talk about the years or decades beyond liberation, when the pressure is indeed being felt to deliver on promises made, and then these liberation movements, they want to hold on to the power they were first greeted with, but then they still have to meet the day-to-day demands and looking after their people. How critical now is it to develop mechanisms, if you will, through which the voices of the people, popular voices, can still be heard, even when these run counter to the attitudes of those in the corridors of power?
Well, if we look at the history of many of these movements, like, for example, ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, that in the first 10 years or so, they were actually sort of model governments, and they were supported by many people all over the world as governments that's really producing results. But I think once a party has become established, that they see that they cannot be challenged by any opposition party, that they start to entrench their interest, and the difference between the party or the movement on the one hand and government on the other hand, and maybe even the state as a third element of it, if those differences start to disappear and there's a merger of those into just one, and that is that the party's interest is completely paramount, then the problems start to develop, because then it is more about the reward for the members of those parties, the distribution of interest for those party members and those supporters. Well, the role of government as the one that must accommodate different interests start to disappear more and more. And I think this is what we've seen in many countries. Once they are starting to be challenged by opposition parties, like, for example, in Botswana, then the initial democratic gains start to become eroded. For example, the media, the freedom of the media is limited to some extent. Opposition figures, some form, the judiciary or the criminal system is being used, criminal justice system, in order to prevent them from participating in elections. We've seen it now in Burundi also, the way in which the president does not want to relinquish his power after the 2 terms. That has happened in Namibia also, with President Njomo wanted to have a 3rd term. So then those problems start to emerge. But so initially, very often, parties started very well. In the case of Angola and Mozambique, our neighbors, that obviously was influenced by the civil war immediately after the independence. So they couldn't establish themselves and consolidate the government and the new party. But countries like Zimbabwe and Namibia, they did it relatively well. I think what is one of the main challenges for those parties is that they have such huge majorities, and they govern for so long, that the normal functioning or the principles of democracy, of changes in government, of the role of the separation of powers between the parliament and the executive and the judiciary, those become blurred. And I think that is what ultimately undermines the vibrancy of those societies. So those are the type of things, and I think in South Africa we start to see a return to the prominence of those constitutional measures that really will determine the quality of life and the quality of democracy in those societies.
Well, former liberation movements like the African National Congress today saying they're concerned by what they call attempts from the West to affect regime change within the Southern African region. Do they have a point, Prof, or perhaps they just don't want to be criticized because they consider themselves the bringers or the stockholders of political freedom and independence?
You know, a typical political strategy, especially at the times of elections, and that is happening all over the world, is very often to create an external target or an external enemy, and that then unifies a population against that external enemy. And I think we have a little bit of that. So the scapegoat is not from within. The problems in the countries are not because of issues within those societies, but they therefore quite easily accuse it from that it is something from outside. The notion of regime change, I think, has become a sort of a concept that scares a lot of people because of the events in Libya after 2011, to some extent what was in the beginning of a process in Syria, and also the fact that the West and the US and Europe imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe and the leadership within Zimbabwe. But it's not a very useful concept because it's not clear exactly what is meant by that. Is it simply because there's a fear that the opposition party is going to take over government, or is it that the whole state structure is going to be overthrown by someone else? I think the concept that the African Union is using in its African Charter is a much more useful one, and that is about to prevent unconstitutional changes of government. So if it is a constitutional change, either through an election or even in some cases through a popular uprising like in Tunisia or in Egypt, then it is still acceptable. But if it is like a military coup, if it is something, an invasion from outside, with outside support, then obviously it is unconstitutional and will not be acceptable by the international community, by the African community, by regional communities, and by the population, the national population themselves. And I think that's a much more useful.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. We are out of time. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us on the SABC News Desk.